It was the night of April 16, 1917, and at the Finland station in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, thousands of people with torches were waiting for a man. There was a moment that night when a man got out of the train and started addressing the people at the station. People want peace, people want bread, people want land. All the people gathered at the train station were Russian citizens, and the person addressing them was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the world as Lenin. In 20th century Europe, they reached a high level of power, but then gradually declined. The man who came to change the history of Russia was admired and feared at the same time. Lenin was born under a monarchy in Russia and spent a large part of his life abroad. But his return to Russia in 1917 shook the country, which at that time was on the brink of revolution. But how did they manage to revolutionize Russia in less than 7 years? What were their theories, actually? Answers to these questions are still being sought today. Lenin was born in the year 1870 in Sambarsk, a small town on the banks of the Volga River. The town was later renamed Ulyanovsk in honor of Lenin. Born into a wealthy family, Lenin was rebellious from an early age, but one event nurtured his anti-imperialist mindset, and that event was the assassination of his brother Alexander. His brother Alexander was executed in 1887. He was accused of attempting to assassinate the then Tsar of the Russian Empire, Alexander the Great. Life was not easy for citizens in the then Russian Empire. Especially those involved in the agricultural profession were forced to live a life of extreme poverty and poverty. In this context, in the year 1885, Lenin took the first revolutionary step and went to jail for propagating and promoting the social democratic movement. Lenin was released from prison after a year, but after his release, he had to spend almost 3 years in exile in Siberia. By 1900, he had arrived in Geneva, where he began working on a new project with other social democrats. The name of this project was Skra. Ikra was a political newspaper which was launched to propagate the ideas of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In Urdu, the word Iskra means spark. The purpose of this newspaper was to run the social democratic movement in the country, even outside of Russia. In this journey of exile, Lenin was accompanied by his wife Nadia, who was also a supporter of revolutionary ideas. Both were followers of the ideas of German philosopher Karl Marx. In 1903 came a time when Lenin's political influence in Russia began to grow. He was temporarily residing in London at that time, and the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was to be held there. Lenin had a central position in this Congress. Their aim was to unite the Russian people against the system of monarchy and capitalism. But as a result of this Congress, it became apparent that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was divided into two factions. On one side were the Mensheviks, who were more enlightened and inclined towards a European democratic parliamentary system. On the other side were the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, and whose aim was to gain power. The Mensheviks' ideas were closer to and more connected to Western European society, says history professor Julian Casanova. The Bolsheviks were an organized, strong, and enlightened political group who were not interested in coming to power through a parliamentary system. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks succeeded and founded the Communist Party, which has been in power in Russia since 1922. The Communist Party favored a one-party state and elected Lenin as its first leader. But how did the Bolsheviks manage to impose a one-party model? To get the answer to this question, we have to go back to the era that changed the history of Russia forever and the beginning of it all. It happened in 1917. At that time, Lenin was living in exile, and the condition of the Russian people was getting worse. There was famine in the rural areas of the country, and the industrial workers were also facing oppression in various forms. Russia's participation in World War I made life more difficult for the people. A coup d'etat in 1917 made Nicholas II of Russia extremely unpopular and eventually forced him to abdicate and abdicate. After that, a provisional government came into being, and the Mensheviks were also part of it. But soon this government faced opposition from the so-called Petrograd Soviet. According to Professor Julian Casanova, at that time the Petrograd Soviet was under the influence of Bolshevik figures, and they had no significant role in the end of the monarchy in Russia. In February 1917, after hearing the news of the impending revolution, Lenin arrived in Russia by train from Switzerland, crossing Germany, Sweden, and Finland. Russia, Lenin, communists. In addition to taking Russia out of World War I, Lenin also fulfilled his promise to establish peace there. On March 3, 1918, an agreement was reached between Russia, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, ending Russia's participation in World War I. But this peace did not prove to be long-lasting, and after the October Revolution, civil war broke out in Russia. The main reason for this was that not everyone recognized Bolshevik rule there. In fact, after the revolution, there was a rift between different groups in Russia, and all these groups wanted to see the future of Russia flourish under the shadow of their respective ideologies. On one side of this struggle was the Red Army of the Bolsheviks under the leadership of Lenin, who were fighting for socialism, and on the other side, there was a group that was more enlightened than them. Russia, Lenin, communists. Image caption: according to the Russian calendar, there was a second revolution in the month of October. Millions of people were killed during the conflict, and supporters of the Bolshevik faction also killed former Tsar Nicholas II and his family. According to Professor Julian Casanova, it was a terrible conflict. She says that the circles of Bolshevik-minded and pro-monarchist soldiers who were convinced of tolerance were also deeply affected by this civil war. And this tolerance was not at all for those who had dissenting opinions or different political views. She says that Lenin described violence and coercion as necessary to unify the new state. Russian intellectuals and members of the Orthodox Church were the most affected in this campaign. Eventually, the Red Army won, and in 1922, the Soviet Union came into being under the leadership of Lenin. But he did not stay in power for long and died of a heart attack within a year. But experts say that Lenin must have had enough time in his life in which he laid the foundations of a repressive regime. After that, Joseph Stalin came to power and continued this system of government. Lenin's funeral in Moscow's Red Square was attended by millions, and his body was chemically preserved and remains there today. In recent years, there have been calls for Lenin's body to be cremated. International communism. Lenin was very much influenced by the socialist movements going on around the world at that time, and it can be inferred from the fact that in one of his speeches, he used the slogan, "Long live the International Social Revolution." It is also important to remember here that Lenin was actually a follower of Karl Marx and wanted to see socialism flourish outside Russia. To fulfill this dream, in 1919, Lenin and other personalities related to Karl Marx founded the Communist International. From then on, its members became known as communists, but the plan to spread communism to the whole world did not succeed. Professor Julian Casanova says that the promotion of communism continued in 1918, 1919, and 1920. There were revolts in Germany, Austria, and Hungary, but the Bolsheviks could not stay in power for long anywhere else. Bela Khan was a Hungarian communist politician who briefly came to power in 1919. But all these revolutions ended in bloodshed, says Professor Julian. She says that in all these countries there were many armed groups that were opposed to Lenin's group and ideas. For all these reasons, Lenin's dream of spreading socialism around the world could not be fulfilled, but he certainly succeeded in laying the foundations of the Soviet Union, which became a superpower that challenged the world's major powers for the next 70 years. 30 years ago today, on December 8th, the leaders of 3 of the 15 republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Russian President Boris Yeltsin, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, and Belarusian Supreme Soviet Chairman leader Stanislav Shushkevich signed the union of the announced the dissolution of the Soviet Socialist Republics, Soviet Union. The 3 leaders exercised their right to secede from the Union in accordance with Article 72 of the Constitution of the Soviet Union at a government recreation building in the town of Vyskoly, Belovezhskaya Pusha, Belarus, after signing the document to dissolve the Soviet Union, announced the establishment of the Commonwealth of States. In the same document, he also condemned the 1922 document establishing the Soviet Union. Coincidentally, these same 3 states signed the founding document of the Soviet Union, the first constitution of the Soviet Union. This announcement dashed hopes of maintaining the Soviet Union as a world power. 4 days later, on 12 December, the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Republic ratified the declaration. And finally, the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, announced his resignation on December 26th, announcing the collapse of the Soviet Union.